Ivy Tran was 19 when her mother called her dorm room to explain, in the tone of someone rescheduling a dentist appointment, that the study abroad program Ivy had spent 14 months applying for, fundraising for, and packing for, a semester in Kunming studying Mandarin and regional trade economics, the first real plan Ivy had ever made entirely for herself, had been given to her sister instead. "We rerouted the payment," her mother, Hoa, said. "Your sister's been struggling, and this experience will help her find herself." Ivy sat on the edge of her extra-long twin bed in a cinderblock dorm room at UMass Amherst, phone pressed to her ear, and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, the way water goes still right before it freezes. "I already have the acceptance letter," Ivy said. "It's in my name. I've been saving for the flight for a year." "The program director said it's transferable if we explain the family circumstances," Hoa said. "Your father already called them. It's done, honey. Don't make this difficult." Her father, Duc, came on the line a moment later, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who ran a dry-cleaning business 14 hours a day and had long ago decided that conflict at home was a luxury he couldn't afford after conflict at work. "You're resilient," he said. "You don't need it the way she does." It was, Ivy understood, even then meant as a compliment. In her father's mind, being called resilient was the highest praise available. It meant she was the daughter who didn't require rescuing, the daughter whose foundation was solid enough to withstand having things taken from her, the daughter who could be trusted to absorb loss without needing repair. He did not seem to hear how the compliment functioned as a life sentence. "You're strong, so you'll be the one who goes without." Her sister, Camille, 22 months younger, had spent the previous 2 years failing out of a marketing program at a different school, cycling through 3 jobs she'd quit within months, and dating a man named Todd whom their parents disliked intensely and blamed, not entirely unfairly, for at least some of Camille's drift. Camille was undeniably struggling. Ivy did not doubt that. What she doubted, what she would spend the next decade quietly, privately doubting, was the specific mathematics her parents had used to solve that struggling, that the fix for one daughter's instability was to extract an opportunity from the other daughter's hands and hope the transplant took. "I thanked them and hung up," Ivy would say later, when she told this story at all, which was rarely. It was the detail people always focused on. Not the unfairness of the decision, but the quietness of her response to it. She did not scream. She did not threaten to withdraw from school in protest. She said, "Okay. Thank you for letting me know," and hung up the phone and sat on her dorm bed for a long time in a silence that had no name yet. 2. Camille's 11 weeks. Camille went to Kunming in September. She came home in November, 11 weeks into a 15-week program, having withdrawn for reasons that shifted depending on who was asking and when. To their mother, it was homesickness compounded by a stomach illness that had never been properly treated. To Ivy, in the one honest conversation the sisters had about it years later, it was simpler and sadder. Camille had never wanted to go. She had gone because their parents needed a project, and she had understood, on some level, that refusing the trip would have meant refusing to be rescued, and refusing to be rescued felt, at 20, like more responsibility than she could hold. "I knew it was your program," Camille told her, at a Thanksgiving 4 years later, both of them a little drunk on their aunt's homemade rice wine, the kind of honesty that only surfaces once a year under specific conditions. "I knew the whole time. I just didn't know how to say no to Mom. I've never known how to say no to Mom. You always did, and I think that's actually why they gave it to me instead of you, because they knew you'd survive losing it and I might not survive being asked to earn it myself." It was, in its way, the closest thing to an apology Ivy would get from anyone in her family for years, and it landed strangely. Not as absolution, but as a fuller, sadder picture of a decision she had spent a long time believing was simply about favoritism. It was about favoritism, and it was also about her parents' near-permanent state of triage, forever trying to patch the child who seemed to be sinking while assuming the child who seemed to be swimming could keep herself afloat indefinitely, assumption that cost Ivy more than her parents would ever fully understand, because swimming indefinitely, it turned out, was exhausting in ways that didn't show from the shore. 3. The library computer. Ivy did not have money for another study abroad program. She had, instead, a public library 3 blocks from her off-campus apartment, a library card, and a stubbornness that had calcified, sometime in the months after that phone call, into something closer to purpose than pain. She began teaching herself Mandarin from a free online course accessed on a library computer with a 50-minute time limit, timing her study sessions around the librarian's schedule, learning to recognize the specific squeak of the returns cart that meant she had 10 minutes left before she'd need to log out and get back in the queue. She supplemented it with a used textbook bought for $4 at a campus book sale, its margins already filled with a stranger's handwriting, corrections, and mnemonics from whoever had owned it before her, a kind of anonymous tutoring she found unexpectedly moving. She read everything she could find about regional trade economics in Yunnan province, the exact region the cancelled program would have taken her to, not because she had a specific plan yet, but because reading about it was the only way she had left to go there. She found, in a trade journal accessed through the university's library database, a small classified listing from a family-run supplier of handloom textiles and specialty teas based outside Kunming, looking for a U.S. distribution partner willing to start small. She emailed them in broken, painstakingly assembled Mandarin, using a dictionary and a grammar guide and roughly 90 minutes of drafting for a message that would have taken a fluent speaker 4. The supplier, a woman named Lin Meihua who ran the business with her husband and had been burned twice before by American buyers who ordered large and then vanished without payment, wrote back, in English, gently correcting exactly none of Ivy's Mandarin errors, which Ivy would understand years later as its own kind of kindness, and agreed to send a small sample shipment if Ivy could cover the modest cost herself. Ivy covered it with money from a work-study job in the campus dining hall, for $100 she'd been saving for a winter coat. The coat did not get bought that year. The shipment arrived instead, 6 bolts of hand-loomed fabric and 8 tins of tea, to her off-campus apartment, and Ivy spent a week selling pieces of it to a small textile shop in Northampton and 2 independent tea sellers in Boston, calling every contact she could find, driving her roommate's car on borrowed gas money, learning in real time what it meant to build something from absolutely nothing but persistence and a library card. 4. The slow build. What followed was not a single triumphant leap, but 11 years of unglamorous, incremental construction, the kind of story that resists being told in a single satisfying scene because it happened, instead, in 1,000 small ones. There was the year Ivy lived in a shared apartment above a laundromat in Worcester, splitting rent 4 ways, working the dining hall job through her final semester and a receptionist job after graduation, funneling every spare dollar into growing the import relationship with Meihua's family, learning to navigate customs paperwork through trial, error, and one memorably disastrous shipment held at a port for 6 weeks over a documentation mistake that nearly bankrupted her. There was the trip, her first at 23, for years after the canceled program, when she finally flew to Kunming herself, on a budget airline with 2 layovers, to meet Meihua and her husband, Chen Wei, in person for the first time. She stayed in their guest room for 9 days, ate every meal with their family, met their college-aged son, Chen Bo, who was studying international business and who would, 6 years later, become Ivy's Yunnan-based operations partner and the man who eventually ran the company's entire sourcing division on the ground. That trip, photographed by Chen Bo on a borrowed camera, Ivy standing in a tea field outside Kunming in a borrowed jacket, laughing at something Meihua had said, utterly unaware that this photograph would matter to anyone beyond the 4 people in that field, was, years later, the exact image that would end up in a magazine profile and change everything. There was the year the business, by then formally incorporated as Meiyun Trading, nearly collapsed when a larger competitor undercut Ivy's pricing on textiles, and she had to pivot hard into specialty tea and later, sustainably sourced ceramics, a pivot that took 18 brutal months and cost her 2 employees she'd hired too early and had to let go, a decision she still, a decade later, thought about with a specific, private guilt she rarely spoke about. There was Priya Nair, her first real hire and eventual chief operating officer, a logistics specialist Ivy had met at a small business trade fair in Providence, who joined the company at its lowest point, 8 months of runway left, no institutional funding, Ivy paying herself less than she'd made at the dining hall job because, as Priya put it later, You were the only founder I met that year who talked about the supplier relationships like they mattered more than the margins. I bet on the person, not the spreadsheet. There was Marcus Whitfield, a small business banker who extended Mayan Trading its first real line of credit in year 4, based largely on his own gut instinct rather than the numbers, which were, at that point, still thin, a decision he later told Ivy he'd made because she was the only applicant that quarter who'd brought printed photographs of her suppliers to the meeting instead of just spreadsheets. And something about the specificity of it, the evident relationship underneath the numbers, had convinced him the business would survive. And there was, running quietly underneath all of it, a life that had nothing to do with the company at all, a serious, 5-year relationship with a woman named Robin, a high school art teacher Ivy had met at a mutual friend's birthday party in year 6 of the business, a relationship that gave Ivy something she hadn't fully realized she was missing, a home that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone, a person who'd never once asked about the company's revenue, and instead asked, every single night, how Ivy's actual day had gone. There was a weekly pottery class Ivy had started attending with Robin, badly, joyfully, in exactly the kind of unbothered amateur spirit her family had never modeled for her. There was a niece, Camille's daughter, born in year 7, whom Ivy adored with an intensity that surprised her, driving 2 hours every month specifically to be present in the girl's life in a way she wished someone had been consistently present in her own. By year 11, Mayan Trading, textiles, tea, ceramics, and by then a growing furniture import line, cleared $90 million in annual revenue, sourcing from a network of family suppliers across Yunnan and neighboring provinces that Ivy had built one relationship, one library computer email, one borrowed jacket trip at a time. The family at a distance. Ivy did not disappear from her family during those 11 years, but she did retreat, carefully and deliberately, into a manageable distance, present at major holidays, cordial on phone calls, forthcoming about almost nothing regarding the actual scale of what she was building. Her parents knew she had a small import business, a phrase Hoa used at family gatherings with a kind of vague, slightly apologetic pride, the tone of someone describing a hobby that had, against expectation, not yet failed. Ivy let them believe it was small. It was not a lie so much as an omission she maintained with the same discipline she'd once used to teach herself Mandarin 50 minutes at a time, because she understood, on some unexamined level, that revealing the actual scale of it would force a reckoning she wasn't ready to have, a conversation about the cancelled program and the resilience complement, and 11 years of quiet, compounding cost that she had never once heard her parents acknowledge. She saw Camille more and differently over those years, not resentfully mostly, though the resentment surfaced sometimes, late at night, uninvited. Camille had eventually found her footing, not in marketing but in early childhood education, a career she'd stumbled into almost by accident and turned out to be genuinely gifted at, beloved by the parents of the preschoolers in her class, promoted twice in 6 years. The two sisters had built, slowly, a real friendship as adults, separate from their parents' orbit, one built on shared jokes about their mother's specific brand of guilt-tripping and long phone calls about nothing in particular, a friendship Ivy valued precisely because it had nothing to do with the study abroad program or who deserved what, a relationship the sisters had, in effect, rebuilt from the rubble their parents had left behind without ever fully discussing the rubble itself. 6. The Journalist. The profile happened almost by accident. A trade publication covering sustainable sourcing in Southeast Asian import industries had been circling Mayan Trading for 2 years, requesting interviews Ivy had consistently declined, wary of visibility, wary of the specific vulnerability that came with being written about. She finally agreed, at Priya's persistent urging, because the company was preparing to open a second warehouse and needed the kind of credibility a feature story could provide with potential investors for the expansion. The Journalist, a careful, thorough writer named Devin Okafor, spent 3 weeks reporting the piece, interviewing Ivy, interviewing Priya, flying to Kunming to interview Mei Hua and Chen Wei and Chen Bo, walking the same tea fields Ivy had first walked 11 years earlier as a 23-year-old with 2 layovers behind her and a borrowed jacket on her back. Chen Bo, digging through old files for the article, found the original photograph, the one he'd taken on a borrowed camera all those years ago, Ivy laughing in a tea field, unaware, and sent it to Devon as an illustration of how far the founding relationship had come. The article ran in March, 6,000 words with photographs, under the headline The $90 Million Bridge, how one founder built an entire trade network from a library computer. It ran the tea field photograph prominently, near the top, captioned simply, Ivy Tran, age 23, on her first sourcing trip to Yunnan province. Hoa found the article the way she found most things about her daughter's professional life, indirectly, through a family friend who'd forwarded it in a group chat with the message, "Isn't this your Ivy?" Hoa opened it on her phone at her kitchen table, expecting, based on the vague scale of small import business she'd always believed, a pleasant human interest piece about a modest family venture. She did not expect $90 million. She did not expect the detailed account of a library computer with a 50-minute time limit, of a $4 used textbook, of a work-study paycheck redirected from a winter coat to a sample shipment. And she did not expect the photograph. She recognized it instantly, not the specific image which she'd never seen but the setting, the particular terraced hillside, the specific quality of light because it was unmistakably, unambiguously the region the study abroad program would have taken Ivy to 11 years earlier. The program Hoa herself had cancelled. The program she had rerouted to Camille with a phone call she'd made from her own kitchen, in an administrative tone, the tone of someone rescheduling a dentist appointment. 7. The call. Hoa called that evening, and Ivy, standing in her own kitchen in Boston, Robin 2 rooms away grading student sketchbooks, watched her mother's name appear on the screen, and felt the specific, complicated dread of a call she had been unconsciously braced for, in some form, for 11 years. "I read the article," Hoa said, and her voice was already unsteady, already cracking in a way Ivy had rarely heard from her mother, who had built her entire adult identity around a specific, unshakable competence, the competence of a woman who had immigrated at 19 with almost nothing and built a life through sheer relentless capability. "Okay," Ivy said, carefully, giving nothing away yet. "The photograph. The tea field. That's Yunnan. That's the program. Ivy, I didn't know you actually went. I thought, all these years, I thought you just, I don't know, I never asked what happened after the phone call. I never asked. I taught myself Mandarin from a library computer," Ivy said, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice was steady, that 11 years of carrying this had somehow made the sentence easier to say aloud rather than harder. "I saved $400 I'd been putting toward a winter coat, and used it for my first shipment. I flew there myself for years later on 2 layovers because I still wanted to see it. I built the whole thing out of the program you took away." There was a long silence on the line, filled only with the sound of her mother's breathing, uneven, and somewhere behind it, faintly, the sound of the television Ivy's father always left on too loud. "I didn't know you," Hoa started and didn't finish the sentence because there was no single ending that could hold what she meant. "I didn't know you still wanted it. I didn't know you'd built something from it. I didn't know what I took. I didn't know you at all, not really, not in the specific, granular way this article seems to know you. All these small facts about your life that I should have known, and instead learned from a stranger's magazine story." "I know, Mom," Ivy said, and it wasn't quite forgiveness, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was simply an acknowledgement of a true and painful fact, offered without softening it, because she had decided, somewhere in those 11 years, that she was done softening things for her parents' comfort. "I thought I was protecting Camille," Hoa said, crying openly now, in a way Ivy had witnessed perhaps 3 times in her entire life. "I thought you didn't need protecting. I thought that made you the stronger one, the safer one to take from. I didn't understand that taking from you still counted as taking. I told myself it didn't, because you always seemed fine. You always said thank you and hung up the phone, and I told myself that meant it was fine." "It was never fine," Ivy said. "I just didn't have the option of not being fine. Someone in that family had to be, and it was never going to be Camille, and it was never going to be you or Dad, so it was me. That's not a compliment, Mom. That's not resilience. That's just what happens to the kid you decide can carry it." 8. What the money couldn't fix. Hoa asked, near the end of the call, in a smaller voice than Ivy had ever heard her use, whether Ivy could ever forgive her. Ivy sat with the question honestly rather than answering it quickly, because she had learned, over 11 years of negotiating supplier contracts and reading rooms full of skeptical investors, that quick answers to hard questions were usually dishonest ones. "I don't know yet," Ivy said. "I think I forgive the decision a little, now that I understand you were drowning too, trying to save Camille, and not realizing you were doing it by taking from me. I don't know if I forgive 11 years of never asking what happened after. That's a different thing. That's not one bad phone call. That's over a decade of a small business you assumed stayed small because you never asked, because asking might have meant reckoning with what the canceled trip actually cost." "Can I meet them?" Hoa asked. "The family. Mei Hua. I'd like to understand what you built. I'd like to actually understand it, not just read about it." "Maybe," Ivy said. "Not yet. I need some time with this first." They talked for a while longer, haltingly, about smaller things. Camille's daughter's upcoming birthday, the second warehouse opening, Duke's declining health, a subject Ivy realized with a small shock she hadn't fully absorbed until this call. Her father's heart trouble mentioned almost in passing, another fact she'd been kept at a slight distance from over the years, the same distance she'd maintained toward them. When they hung up, Ivy stood in her kitchen for a long time, the phone warm in her hand, and felt something that wasn't relief exactly, and wasn't closure, but was, perhaps, the beginning of a different, more honest kind of relationship than the one she'd been managing at arm's length for over a decade. 9. Camille. Camille called 2 days later, having heard about the article from their mother, and the conversation between the sisters was easier, warmer, unburdened by the specific guilt Hoa carried. "I always knew it was bigger than small," Camille said. "I just didn't push because I think some part of me needed to believe you'd built something modest so I wouldn't have to sit with how much bigger my failure to use the actual trip looked in comparison." "It was never a competition," Ivy said. "I know, but it felt like one, for years on my end. You got nothing and built an empire. I got everything and came home in 11 weeks. I used to lie awake doing that math, and it never came out anywhere good for me." "For what it's worth," Ivy said, "I don't think you failed anything. I think you were 19 and got handed someone else's dream and asked to want it, and you couldn't because it was never actually yours to want." "I know that now," Camille said. Took me a long time to stop being angry about it too," Ivy admitted. "I'm not sure I'm all the way there. I don't think I need to be, to keep loving you. I just needed you to know that." The warehouse opening. The second warehouse opened in June, in a converted industrial building outside Providence, with Priya running the ribbon-cutting logistics and Chinbo flying in from Kunming for his first visit to the American side of the operation he'd helped build from thousands of miles away. Robin came, standing quietly at the back with Ivy's niece, now 8, who had insisted on wearing her fanciest dress for the occasion and spent most of the event examining the ceramics display with fierce, serious curiosity. Hoa and Duk came too, at Ivy's invitation, extended carefully, tentatively, 3 weeks after the phone call, an invitation Ivy had debated sending for several days before deciding that whatever repair was possible between them would require some concrete, shared occasion to begin building around, rather than more phone calls circling the same wound. Duk, walking slowly now, his heart trouble visible in a new carefulness to his movements that Ivy found unexpectedly frightening, stood for a long time in front of the framed photograph Ivy had hung near the entrance. The tea field, the borrowed jacket, 23-year-old Ivy laughing at something just out of frame. "I said you were resilient," he said, when Ivy came to stand beside him. "I meant it as praise. I understand now it wasn't only praise. I'm sorry it cost you what it cost you." "I know, Dad." "Are you happy?" he asked, an unusually direct question from a man who had spent Ivy's whole life speaking mostly in logistics and obligations rather than feelings. "With all of it. Not the money. The actual thing." Ivy considered the question seriously, looking around the warehouse, Priya laughing with Chinbo near the loading dock, Robin crouched down explaining a ceramic glaze technique to her niece, Meihua's voice audible faintly through a video call Chinbo had set up on a tablet so his mother could see the American warehouse she'd never visited, the whole sprawling, improbable structure of a life built out of a 50-minute library computer session and a $4 textbook and a canceled plane ticket that had never, in the end, stopped her from going anywhere at all. She said. I built something real. I don't regret any of it, even the parts that hurt. But I want you to understand something, Dad, and I need you to actually hear it, not just nod at it. I would have traded every dollar of this for you and Mom to have simply asked me, at 19, what I wanted, and believed the answer mattered as much as Camille's. I built $90 million out of not being asked. I would still rather have been asked. Her father didn't have an answer for that, and Ivy hadn't expected one. Some costs, she had come to understand over 11 years of building something extraordinary out of something taken, simply didn't have an answer that made them even. They only had, if you were lucky, people willing to finally stand still long enough to look at what the cost had actually been, and that, imperfect and incomplete as it was, standing in a warehouse full of tea and textiles and ceramics and family, some of it blood, and some of it chosen, was for now enough to keep building from.